Deep in Wyoming's unforgiving wilderness, where the winter wind tells ancient tales, James McKinnon's faithful companion Buck made a discovery that would change everything. There, half buried in the merciless snow, lay a woman with skin as pale as moonlight, her dark hair scattered like ink against the white canvas of winter. James hadn't seen those familiar features in 20 years, not since the day Sarah Mitchell's family disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a broken promise of marriage and a lifetime of unanswered questions. Now, as he carries her lifeless form back to his cabin, the old wound in his heart begins to thaw. What cruel twist of fate would bring her back to him, hovering between life and death after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old leather-bound Bible lay open on James McKinnon's desk, its pages yellowed with age, but carefully preserved through generations of careful hands. In the dim light of his study, he traced his weathered finger across the family names inscribed. Within, each one a thread in the tapestry of the McKinnon legacy. Between its pages, pressed and preserved for 2 decades, lay a single purple wildflower, its color barely visible now, but still holding the memory of the day Sarah Mitchell had placed it in his palm. Buck's nails clicked against the hardwood floor as he padded over to rest his graying muzzle on James's knee. The Australian shepherd had been his constant companion for 8 years now, ever since James found him as a scrawny pup in an abandoned barn during a particularly harsh winter. Something in those intelligent eyes had reminded him of his own lost soul, searching for purpose in the vast Wyoming wilderness. The McKinnon Ranch had stood proud for 4 generations, its sprawling 5,000 acres nestled in the shadow of the Wind River Range. James's great-grandfather had built the main house with his own hands, using timber from the surrounding forest. Every morning, James would stand on the wraparound porch, coffee mug in hand, and watch the sun paint the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink. It was a view that never grew old, even after 45 years. The ranch hands had all gone home for the evening, leaving James alone with his thoughts and his faithful companion. He preferred it this way, the quiet solitude of winter nights when the only sounds were the crackling of the fireplace and the occasional howl of wind through the eaves. These were the moments when memories crept in, uninvited but persistent. Like shadows lengthening at dusk, his father's voice still echoed in these halls. "A McKinnon man stands by his word, son. Our handshake means something in this valley." Those words had shaped him, molded him into the man he'd become. Even when the bank came calling during the drought of '98, even when modernization threatened to make their way of life obsolete, the McKinnons had persevered. They adapted without compromising their principles, expanding into sustainable ranching practices while maintaining the traditions that had served them well for over a century. But there were some promises that lay beyond a man's power to keep. The memory of Sarah's tear-stained face on that last morning still haunted him. She'd been barely 18, him 21, both of them full of dreams as vast as the Wyoming sky. They'd made their promises under the old cottonwood tree, sealing their future with his grandmother's ring and innocent hearts that couldn't fathom the complexities of adult lives. Buck whined softly, sensing his master's melancholy. James scratched behind the dog's ears, drawing comfort from the simple affection. "You're right, old friend. No use dwelling on what can't be changed." But even as he spoke the words, his eyes drifted to the small silver frame on his desk. A faded photograph of 2 young people standing before that same cottonwood tree, their smiles untouched by the knowledge of what lay ahead. The Mitchell family's disappearance had become something of a legend in the valley. Some said they'd run from debt collectors, others whispered about witness protection. The truth had slipped away like water through cupped hands, leaving behind nothing but questions and a hollow ache in James's chest that never quite healed. Buck suddenly lifted his head, ears pricking forward. A moment later, James heard it too. The rising wind that signaled an approaching storm. He rose from his chair, joints protesting slightly, and moved to check the weather radio. The forecast called for heavy snow overnight, temperatures dropping well below zero. It was the kind of night that reminded a man of his mortality, of the fierce and unforgiving nature of Wyoming winters. The morning dawned bitter cold, the kind that turned breath to ice and made steel brittle as glass. James stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow fall in thick curtains, while Buck wolfed down his breakfast. The old ranch map on the wall caught his eye, its worn edges and faded lines telling stories of generations past. The trail where Sarah would later be found was barely visible, marked by his grandfather's careful hand as North Ridge Pass. Something had Buck on edge this morning. The dog kept pacing between the door and James, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an anxious energy that set James's teeth on edge. Years of working with animals had taught him to trust their instincts. When Buck finally let out a low whine and scratched at the door, James knew better than to ignore it. "All right, boy, let me gear up first." He pulled on his heavy winter coat, wool-lined boots, and thick gloves. The temperature gauge outside his window read 15 below zero. Dangerous weather, to be sure, but nothing a McKinnon hadn't faced before. Buck led the way, his black and white coat almost invisible. Against the snow, the dog moved with purpose, taking the trail that wound up toward the north pasture. James followed, the crunch of his boots in the snow and his labored breathing the only sounds in the frozen landscape. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They'd gone about 2 miles when Buck suddenly stopped, nose working the air. Before James could call him back, the dog darted off the trail, disappearing into a small ravine. James's heart jumped into his throat. In this weather, a wrong step could mean a broken leg or worse. "Buck!" he called out, voice carrying in the still air. "Buck, come back here!" The answering bark held a note he'd never heard before, urgent, almost panicked. James cursed under his breath and carefully made his way down the slope. The snow was deep here, drifted against the lee side of the ravine. Buck stood rigid, pawing at something half buried in the white expanse. At first, James thought it might be an injured animal. But as he drew closer, his blood turned colder than the air around him. A human hand protruded from the snow, its skin blue-white against the pristine backdrop. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees and began digging. The snow gave way beneath his frantically working hands, revealing more of the body. Dark hair fanned out like spilled ink, a face turned away from him, half buried still. But even before he gently turned her head, something deep in his soul recognized her. The years fell away like autumn leaves, and suddenly he was 21. Again, watching Sarah Mitchell walk away for what he thought was the last time. "Dear God," he breathed, fingers trembling as they sought a pulse in her ice-cold neck. There, faint as a whisper, but present. She was alive, if barely. The wind was picking up again, carrying the promise of more snow. They had perhaps an hour before the storm hit in earnest. Buck pressed against his side, whining softly, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. James shrugged out of his coat, wrapping it around Sarah's still form. She wore only a light jacket, completely inadequate for Wyoming in winter. What had brought her out here, so far from anywhere, in such weather? Questions would have to wait. Right now, his only priority was getting her somewhere warm. As gently as he could, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and the thought sent a spike of fear through his heart. How long had she been out here? What twist of fate had brought her back to his land, only to nearly claim her life? "Lead the way home, Buck," he commanded, and the dog didn't hesitate. They set off back toward the ranch house, moving as quickly as James dared. With his precious burden, the wind was rising now, driving needles of ice against his face, but he barely felt it. All he could focus on was the faint warmth of Sarah's breath against his neck, each one a miracle in itself. 20 years of questions, of wondering, of trying to move on, all of it crystallized in this moment. Whatever had brought her back, whatever storms lay ahead, James knew with bone-deep certainty that nothing would make him let her go again. Not if she lived through this. Please God, let her live through this. As James carried Sarah's limp form into the warmth of his home, a flash of silver caught his eye, a locket half frozen against her neck. He remembered that locket. He'd given it to her on her 16th birthday, watched her eyes light up as she opened it to find their photo inside, taken at the county fair 2 summers before everything fell apart. Buck nudged open doors ahead of them as James made his way to the guest bedroom, his arms aching, but refusing to loosen their grip. The room hadn't seen use in months, but he kept it ready out of habit, his mother's training still governing his housekeeping after all these years. Always be prepared for visitors, she'd say, even when you think you're alone in the world. Laying Sarah on the bed, he worked quickly to assess her condition. Her skin was dangerously cold, her breathing shallow. Frostbite threatened her fingers and the tip of her nose, but thankfully hadn't progressed too far. The real worry was her core temperature. He needed to warm her gradually, carefully. Too much heat too quickly could send her into shock. While he worked, memories filtered through his mind like old photographs falling from a forgotten album. The summer evening when they'd first talked about marriage, sitting on the hood of his truck under a sky full of stars. The way she'd laughed when he fumbled the words, nervous as a colt in his first saddle. "James McKinnon," she'd said, "are you asking me to be your wife?" He'd had it all planned out, the ring hidden in his pocket, the speech he'd practiced for weeks. But in that moment, looking at her face in the starlight, all he could manage was a simple yes. It had been enough. Her kiss had tasted of cherry soda and promises, and the future had seemed as bright and endless as the Wyoming sky. 2 months later, she was gone. The Mitchell house stood empty, a for sale sign swaying in the autumn wind. No note, no explanation, just whispered rumors and the hollow echo of unanswered questions. He'd searched for answers, of course, spent months following leads that led nowhere, calling numbers that no longer worked, writing letters that came back marked "Return to Sender." Buck's low whine brought him back to the present. The dog had settled at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that spoke of both concern and protection. James checked her pulse again. Stronger now, thank God. Her skin felt warmer to the touch, though she remained unconscious. In the dim light, she looked both familiar and strange. 20 years had left their mark in the fine lines around her eyes, the slight silver threading through her dark hair. But beneath those changes, she was still Sarah, the girl who'd known all his dreams, who'd shared his love for this harsh, beautiful land. The locket had thawed enough for him to open it now. Inside, protected by the silver casing, the photograph remained clear. 2 young faces smiling at a future they couldn't see. James touched it gently, remembering the day it was taken. They'd been so young, so certain of their path. What had happened to derail it so completely? A soft moan from Sarah drew his attention. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He leaned closer, hope and fear warring in his chest. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. He pressed a glass of water to her mouth, letting a few drops fall between her parched lips. She swallowed reflexively, then grew still again, but her breathing had deepened, become more regular. She was fighting her way back. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, rattling windows and throwing snow against the glass. But inside this room, time seemed to stand still. James settled into the chair beside the bed, knowing sleep wouldn't come. Buck rested his head on James's knee, offering silent comfort as they began their vigil. "What happened to you, Sarah?" he whispered to the quiet room. "What ghosts drove you back to this place after all these years?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered, but for the first time in 20 years, he dared to hope he might finally learn the truth. James's hands trembled slightly as he opened his mother's old medical kit, its leather case still supple after decades of careful maintenance. Martha McKinnon had been the closest thing to a doctor this part of the county had for 30 years, and her supplies were organized with surgical precision, even now, 5 years after her passing. "You'll need these someday," she told him, showing him how to dress wounds, set bones, treat frostbite. "The land doesn't care about ambulance response times, son." He'd paid attention, knowing how often winter storms could cut off the ranch from town, but he'd never imagined using those skills to save Sarah Mitchell's life. Buck's alertness caught his attention. Sarah's breathing had changed, becoming more labored. James quickly checked her temperature with the old mercury thermometer. Still dangerously low, but rising. Too fast, too slow. He wished his mother were here to guide his hands. The medical kit yielded what he needed. Thermal blankets, hot packs, bandages for her frost-nipped fingers. He worked methodically, the way his mother had taught him. "Panic kills more surely than any wound," she'd say. "Steady hands, steady heart." Sarah's skin was warming gradually, color returning to her cheeks. But something wasn't right. Her face contorted in pain when he moved her left arm, and the angle looked wrong. Probable break, maybe from a fall. He'd need to immobilize it properly once she was stable. "Stay with me, Sarah," he murmured, wrapping her in another layer of blankets. "You didn't survive 20 years in a Wyoming blizzard just to give up now." Buck whined in agreement, his warm body pressed against Sarah's legs through the blankets, providing additional heat. The wind rattled the windows with increasing fury, and James knew they were on their own. No chance of getting a doctor up here. Until the storm passed, which could be days. The satellite phone might work, but reception was spotty in weather like this. He'd try it soon, but first he needed to ensure Sarah was stable. Her lips moved again, forming silent words. James leaned closer, straining to hear. "Running," she whispered, lost in some fever dream. "Can't let them find." The words trailed off into unconsciousness, but they sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Running from what? From whom? The questions multiplied like shadows at sunset, but they'd have to wait. Right now, Sarah needed him focused on the present, on keeping her alive through the night. He checked her pulse again. Stronger now, more regular. Her breathing had eased somewhat, though each inhale seemed to cause her pain. Possible broken ribs, too. Buck suddenly raised his head, ears forward. A moment later, James heard it too. A vehicle's engine, struggling against the storm. He moved to the window, peering through snow-frosted glass. Headlights pierced the whiteout conditions, moving slowly up his drive. The county sheriff's Bronco. He'd bet money on it. Ted Matthews always did have a sixth sense about trouble. "Stay with her, Buck," James commanded, though the dog showed no intention of leaving Sarah's side. He headed downstairs, grateful for help but uneasy about questions he couldn't answer. Why was Sarah here? What had happened to her? The mysteries would have to wait. The immediate challenge was keeping her alive through this storm, keeping her safe until she could tell her own story. James McKinnon had failed to protect her once, 20 years ago. He wouldn't fail again. Whatever shadows she was running from, whatever ghosts haunted her steps, they'd have to come through him to reach her. A pounding at the door echoed through the house. James squared his shoulders, rehearsing the careful balance of truth and omission he'd need to navigate. Sarah's secrets were her own to reveal. For now, she was simply a stranger he'd found in the snow, a story Ted would accept without too many questions, at least until the storm passed. But deep in his gut, James knew this was just the beginning, the real storm, the one that had driven Sarah back to his land after all these years, was still gathering strength. And when it broke, it would test everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the price of keeping promises. Sheriff Ted Matthews stomped snow from his boots in James's entryway, his weathered face creased with concern. "Saw your tracks, heading up North Ridge this morning. Getting mighty dangerous out there, James." He paused, reading something in James's expression. "Found something, didn't you?" The conversation that followed was carefully measured, like mixing gunpowder. Yes, he'd found a woman. No, he didn't know her full story. Yes, she needed medical attention. But moving her in this weather was too risky. Ted nodded, accepting each answer with the patience of a man who'd served the county for 30 years. "Doc Sanders is snowed in down at Miller's Ranch," Ted said, running a hand through his grey hair. "But I've got the satellite radio if we need it." He didn't ask the question hanging in the air, why James's hands shook slightly when he mentioned the woman upstairs, or why Buck had positioned himself at the foot of the stairs like a guardian. A soft sound from above drew their attention. Buck's claws clicked against the hardwood as he rushed upstairs with James close behind. Ted followed more slowly, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. Sarah was awake. Her eyes, those same deep brown eyes that had haunted James's dreams for 20 years, fluttered open. Confusion clouded them at first. Then recognition hit, like a lightning strike. "James!" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough with cold and disuse. Is this real?" "I'm here, Sarah," he said, moving to her side. "You're safe now." The words caught in his throat, thick with emotions he couldn't name. Buck pressed against his leg, offering silent support. Ted's sharp intake of breath from the doorway said he recognized her too. The Mitchell disappearance had been his first major case as sheriff, one that had gone cold, despite months of investigation. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Sarah's eyes darted to Ted, then back to James. Fear flickered across her face, quickly masked, but unmistakable. Her good hand clutched at the blankets. "The letter," she said urgently. "In my coat pocket. You need to—" She broke off, coughing. James retrieved her coat from where it hung by the fire. The pocket yielded a worn envelope, sealed but crumpled, the paper yellow with age. His name was written on the front in Sarah's familiar handwriting, though the ink had faded to brown. "I wrote it the day we left," she managed between shallow breaths. "Never had the courage to mail it. Carried it with me all these years, telling myself, someday." She closed her eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. James held the letter like it might crumble to dust in his hands. 20 years of answers, perhaps, sealed in this envelope. But Sarah's next words drove all thoughts of the letter from his mind. "They found me again," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go. The ranch, you. It was the only safe place I could think of." Her voice broke on the last words, and tears slid down her cheeks. Ted moved closer, his professional demeanor taking over. "Who found you, Sarah? Who are you running from?" But Sarah had slipped back into unconsciousness, her face tight with pain. Even in sleep, Buck whined softly, laying his head on the bed beside her hand. The dog's loyalty to this woman he'd just met spoke volumes to James. Buck had always been an excellent judge of character. "James," Ted said quietly, "you know I need to report this. She's been a missing person for 20 years. There'll be questions." "She needs time to heal first," James replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Whatever she's running from, whatever happened 20 years ago, it can wait until she's stronger." He looked down at the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of unspoken words within. Ted sighed, but nodded. "I'll radio Doc Sanders, see if he can talk us through anything we need to know about treating her injuries. But James," he paused at the door. "Watch your back. People don't usually run from nothing." After Ted left to make the call, James sat in the chair beside Sarah's bed, the letter burning a hole in his pocket. Buck settled at his feet, alert and protective. Outside, the storm raged on, but in here, time seemed to move like molasses, thick with memory and possibility. He watched Sarah sleep, noting how her face had maintained that same gentle strength he'd loved so much in their youth. Whatever storms had buffeted her these past 20 years hadn't broken that core of resilience. She'd survived, carried his letter, and found her way back to him. The rest, the explanations, the dangers, the years of silence, would come in time. For now, It was enough that she was here, breathing softly in his mother's guest room, while Buck stood guard and the Wyoming winter howled its ancient songs outside. The Mitchell family document lay unfolded on James's desk, its crisp letterhead bearing the weight of decades. Sarah had insisted he read it first, before she attempted to explain everything else. Her hands had trembled as she'd pulled it from a hidden compartment in her locket, the final piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 20 years. Mitchell Holdings Acquisition Agreement, the heading read. Below it, in dense legal language, lay the story of why Sarah's family had vanished that autumn morning. It wasn't about debt or witness protection or any of the other theories that had circulated through the county. It was about power, corruption, and a choice no 18-year-old girl should have had to make. My father discovered the fraud, too. Late, Sarah spoke softly from where she sat, propped up in bed, her splintered arm cradled against her chest. The afternoon light caught the silver in her hair, making it shimmer like frost. The partners he trusted, they'd been using the company to launder money for years. When he threatened to expose them, she trailed off, the memory clearly painful. James stood at the window, processing what he'd read. The Mitchell family construction business had been respected throughout Wyoming. The idea that it had been used as a front for organized crime seemed impossible, yet the evidence was there in black and white. They gave him a choice, Sarah continued, her voice stronger now. Disappear with his family and stay quiet, or watch everything he'd built become evidence in a federal investigation, including the people he loved. The implications hung heavy in the air. Buck, who hadn't left Sarah's side since she'd regained consciousness, pressed closer to her leg. She absently stroked his head, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Dad chose to protect us. We left that night, with nothing but what we could carry. New names, new lives, always looking over our shoulders. But why now? James turned from the window, meeting her eyes. After 20 years, why did they suddenly find you again? Sarah's laugh held no humor. Because I got tired of running. After Dad passed last year, I started digging, found evidence he'd hidden away, enough to bring down what's left of their operation. I thought, she swallowed hard, I thought I could finally set things right, give us back our real names, our real lives. They found out, James said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. 2 days ago. Barely got away with the documents. I knew I had to get them somewhere safe, to someone I could trust. Her eyes met his, full of memories and unspoken words. You were always that person, James, even after all these years. The wind rattled the windows, reminding them of the storm still raging outside, but James barely heard it, his mind racing. Through implications and possibilities. The evidence, you still have it? Hidden, she confirmed. Not here. I couldn't risk leading them straight to it. But if anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you. James's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. Not this time. He moved to her bedside, taking her good hand in his. It felt right, like finding the last piece of a puzzle you'd been working on for years. We'll figure this out together. Buck's sudden alertness made them both tense. The dog's ears perked forward, his body going rigid. A moment later, James heard what had caught Buck's attention, the distant sound of engines, more than one, making their way up the snow-covered road. To the ranch. They found me, Sarah whispered, fear and resignation warring in her voice. James, I'm so sorry. I never meant to bring this to your door. But James was already moving, his mind shifting into the sharp focus that generations of ranchers had, honed when facing danger. Buck, stay with her, he commanded. The dog didn't need to be told twice, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. We're not running, James said, checking the ammunition in his father's old rifle. This is McKinnon land, has been for 4 generations, and McKinnons protect what's theirs. He looked at Sarah, letting 20 years of unspoken feeling show. In his eyes. Always have, always will. The engines grew louder, and Sarah straightened despite her injuries, that familiar determination settling over her features. Whatever came through that door would find them together, facing it head-on, just like they should have done 20 years ago. The approaching engines died suddenly, leaving only the howl of the wind. James pulled his mother's handmade quilt higher, around Sarah's shoulders, as she sat in the old rocking chair near the fireplace. They'd moved downstairs for better defensibility, though Sarah had insisted on walking herself, leaning heavily on James's arm. Her independent spirit hadn't changed, even after all these years. The quilt was a masterpiece of Martha McKinnon's craftsmanship, each square telling a story of the ranch's history. Sarah's fingers traced a pattern she remembered from their youth, the summer fair where they'd first danced, captured in fabric and thread. "Your mother always did say she was stitching memories, not just quilts," she murmured. "Sheriff Matthews," James said quietly, recognizing the figure trudging through the snow toward his porch. Relief loosened some of the tension in his shoulders, but not all. Ted wasn't alone. 2 state police vehicles were parked behind his Bronco, their lights cutting through the storm's gloom. Buck stood alert but calm, suggesting these visitors weren't the threat they'd feared. Still, James kept his father's rifle close as he opened the door to Ted's knock. "James?" Ted nodded, snow dusting his shoulders. "Sarah brought some help." He gestured to the officers behind him. State police caught wind of some suspicious characters asking questions in town. "Thought we'd better check on you folks." The lead officer, a weathered woman with captain's bars, stepped forward. "Captain Lisa Martinez," she introduced herself. "We've been tracking a crime syndicate's activities across 3 states. When your name came up in their communications, Ms. Mitchell, we moved fast." Sarah's hand found James's as Captain Martinez continued. "The evidence you gathered about their operations, we need it. Combined with what we already have, it could shut them down for good." "The documents are safe," Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Hidden where they'll never find them. But I had to make sure." She looked up at James, years of guilt and hope warring in her eyes. "I had to know if there was still something worth coming back to before I trusted anyone with them." James squeezed her hand gently. "Always," he said simply. The weight of 20 years of waiting, of wondering, of loving despite the silence, filled that single word. Buck padded over to Sarah, resting his head on her knee as if he'd known her all his life. She scratched behind his ears with her good hand, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "The evidence is in a safety deposit box," she told Captain Martinez. "In Sheridan. Box 1147, under the name Catherine Mills. The key is—" she smiled, faintly. "Well, let's just say they'd never think to look where I put it." The captain nodded, understanding the need for discretion. "We'll need your help retrieving it, but that can wait until you're stronger. For now, we've got officers watching all approaches to the ranch. You're safe here." Ted cleared his throat. "Might want to show them what else we found, Captain." He handed her a tablet and she swiped through several images before passing it to Sarah. "Recognized these men?" she asked. "They were asking about you at the Silver Dollar this morning. Fortunately, our surveillance team spotted them first." Sarah's face paled as she looked at the photos. "Anton Kovac," she whispered. "He was one of the original partners. I thought he'd died years ago." "Faked his death," Captain Martinez corrected. "He's been running things from the shadows ever since. But your evidence could change that." James studied the man in the photo. Expensive coat, cold eyes, the look of someone used to taking what he wanted. The kind of man who'd force a family to abandon their whole life, who'd hunt a woman across decades just to keep his secrets buried. The wind chose that moment to howl particularly fiercely, making the old house creak. Buck's ears twitched, but he remained calm, a solid presence against Sarah's legs. The quilt around her shoulders caught the firelight, its patterns throwing familiar shadows on the wall, scenes of ranch life, of family, of home. "You should both get some rest," Ted suggested, ever practical. "We've got people watching every approach. Nothing's getting near this ranch tonight without us knowing." As the officers settled into their watchful routine, James built up the fire, Sarah remained in the rocking chair, her eyes distant but clearer than they'd been all day. The quilt, his mother's last gift to the ranch, wrapped her in generations of McKinnon history, as if the family had been waiting all these years to welcome her home. "I never stopped loving you," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, "even when I thought I'd never see you again, even when I convinced myself it was better that way." James knelt beside her chair, taking her hand in both of his. "Some things," he said softly, "are worth waiting for." Dawn broke reluctantly over the snow-covered ranch, painting the world in shades of grey and pearl. James found the threatening note while checking the perimeter with one of the state police officers. It was pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife. Expensive, custom-made, with a distinctive eagle worked into the handle. "Don't make your father's mistake twice, Sarah. Some secrets are better left buried in the snow." The officer photographed everything before carefully bagging the note and knife as evidence. But the message had already done its work, sending a chill through the ranch that had nothing to do with the winter morning. Inside, Sarah's face went ash-white when James showed her a photo of the knife. "That's Anton's personal blade," she said, quietly. "He used to keep it on display in his office. Said it was a reminder that some problems required direct solutions." Her good hand trembled as she handed the phone back. Buck growled low in his throat, picking up on the tension in the room. Captain Martinez studied the photo with narrowed eyes. "He's getting desperate," she observed, "breaking cover like this, leaving evidence. It's not his usual style." "Because he's running out of time," Sarah said, straightening in her chair, despite the pain it clearly caused her. "The documents I found, they don't just prove the money laundering. They show connections to 3 unsolved murders, including the real reason my father's oldest friend disappeared right before we left." James remembered Martin Cooper's disappearance. It had been written off as a hunting accident, his body never found. "They killed him because he knew." Sarah nodded grimly. "Dad figured it out too late. That's what forced his hand. It wasn't just about protecting the family business anymore. It was about keeping us alive." She looked down at her splintered arm. "I thought 20 years would be enough time, that they'd be less dangerous now. I was wrong." Captain Martinez's radio crackled with a status update from her teams. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow and roads that would take days to clear completely. They were still isolated, but at least they could see threats coming now. James moved to the window, scanning the tree line. Out of habit, the fresh snow would make tracking easier, but it also meant anyone approaching the ranch would have to leave clear signs of their presence. A mixed blessing. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. She pulled a folded paper. From her pocket, another note, this one worn and creased with age. "I found this in Dad's effects after he died. It's what started me looking into everything again." She handed it to Captain Martinez, who read it with increasing interest. "Coordinates," the captain said, "and a series of numbers, account numbers, locations," Sarah corrected. "Places where Dad hid copies of everything. He never trusted electronic storage, said paper couldn't be hacked." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "The originals are in that safety deposit box. But there are 3 other complete sets. Insurance, he called it." James felt a surge of admiration for Sarah's father. Thomas Mitchell had been a careful man, methodical in everything he did. Of course he wouldn't leave something this important without backup plans. Buck's sudden alertness drew everyone's attention. The dog moved to the front door, ears forward, a low rumble building in his chest. James reached for his rifle, but Captain Martinez was already moving, her hand on her service weapon as she checked the security feed they'd set up overnight. "Vehicle coming up the south road," she reported. "Black SUV, no plates visible." "Anton likes black SUVs," Sarah said softly. "Says they're classic for a reason." James made a quick decision. "There's a cellar under the barn," he said. "Old storm shelter from my grandfather's day. Entrance is hidden under the tack room floor. If things go bad—" "I'm not hiding," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "I'm not running anymore, James. Whatever comes, we face it together." Their eyes met. 20 years of separation dissolving in a moment of shared determination. Buck moved between them, his posture alert but calm, a guardian ready for whatever approached. Together, James agreed, checking his rifle one last time. Outside, the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, and the morning sun caught the fresh snow in 1,000 diamond points of light. Whatever came next would happen in the clear light of day, with nowhere for shadows to hide. While Captain Martinez and her team took up positions around the property, Sarah reached for the chain around her neck. From it, she withdrew not just her locket, but a small gold ring James hadn't noticed before. His breath caught as he recognized it, his grandmother's promise ring, the one he'd given Sarah that summer evening 20 years ago. "I never could bring myself to take it off," she admitted softly, turning the ring so it caught the morning light. The small diamond still sparkled, though the band showed signs of wear. "Even when we were running, changing names every few months, this was the one piece of my real life I kept." Dad understood, said some promises were worth the risk of keeping. James moved closer, drawn by the gravity of memory and meaning. Buck stayed alert by the window but kept glancing back at them, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Outside, they could hear Captain Martinez giving quiet orders over her radio. "I used to imagine finding you again," Sarah continued, her voice thick with emotion. 1,000 different ways, 1,000 different conversations. But I never pictured this. She gestured to her splintered arm, managed a small laugh. "Though I suppose showing up half frozen on your property isn't the worst way it could have happened." "You could have come to me sooner," James said. But there was no accusation in his voice, just the soft ache of lost years. "I would have helped, protected you." "That's exactly why I couldn't." Sarah's good hand found his, squeezed gently. "They would have killed you, James. Just like Martin Cooper. I couldn't bear the thought of your death being my fault." She swallowed hard. "So, I stayed away. Told myself you'd moved on, built a new life. It was easier than admitting I was just afraid." The approaching vehicle was closer now, its engine sound distinct in the crisp morning air. But for this moment, they remained in their bubble of shared truth, of barriers finally breaking down. "I tried moving on," James admitted. "Dated a few times over the years, but none of them were you." He smiled slightly. "Mom used to say I was being stubborn, holding on to a ghost, but she kept your photo in the family album anyway." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Martha always did see more clearly than most." She glanced at the quilt still draped over her shoulders. "I missed her funeral, saw the notice in a paper 3 states away. That was one of the hardest days." James reached out, brushed a tear from her cheek. The gesture felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like speaking a language you'd learned in childhood and never quite forgotten. "She knew you had your reasons, never doubted it for a moment." Buck's sudden shift in posture interrupted the moment. The dog's ears were forward, his tail straight, alert but not aggressive. A moment later, Sheriff Matthews' voice came over the radio. "Vehicle approaching the main gate. It's Eleanor Cooper." Sarah gasped softly. "Martin's widow? But she moved away years ago, right after he disappeared." "Came back last spring," James explained. "Bought her old family property over on Miller Creek. Keeps to herself, mostly." He studied Sarah's expression. "You think it's connected?" "Has to be," Sarah said. "The timing's too perfect." She straightened in her chair, wincing slightly. "I need to talk to her. If she's been carrying her own secrets all these years." Captain Martinez's voice cut through their speculation. Vehicles stopping at the gate. One occupant, female, appears to be in her 60s. She's holding something, looks like an old briefcase. Sarah's hand tightened on James's. "Martin's briefcase. He always said if anything happened to him, Eleanor would know what to do with his papers." Her voice held wonder and growing hope. "She's been waiting too, all these years, protecting his evidence, just like Dad protected his." James helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her as she found her balance. Buck pressed against her other side, offering his own steady strength. Together they moved to the window to watch Eleanor Cooper's slow approach up the snow-covered drive. "Whatever she's bringing," James said quietly, Whatever comes next, we face it together this time. He looked down at the promise ring, still catching morning light. Some promises don't need renewing, they just need the chance to be kept. Sarah leaned into his strength, her head resting against his shoulder in a gesture that bridged 20 years of separation. Together, she agreed softly. Outside, Eleanor Cooper parked her car and stepped out into the snow, clutching a weathered leather briefcase like it held the answers to 20 years of questions. Perhaps it did. The weather radio crackled with static before delivering its warning. Another storm system was moving in from the northwest, stronger than the last. But it wasn't the only storm gathering around the McKinnon ranch. Eleanor Cooper sat at James's kitchen table, Martin's briefcase open before her, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she sorted through 2 decades of carefully preserved documents. Martin knew they were watching him, she said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. That last week he was different, nervous, started telling me about backup plans, about things I needed to know if anything happened to him. She pulled out a thick envelope, sealed with wax. The night before he disappeared, he gave me this. Said if Sarah Mitchell ever came back, I'd know it was time. Buck lay alert by the door, dividing his attention between watching the windows and keeping close to Sarah. The dog seemed to sense the weight of the moment, the tension building like the approaching weather front. The hunting accident was staged, Eleanor continued, looking directly at Sarah. They wanted it to look random, but Martin knew. He left a letter explaining everything. She smiled sadly. 20 years I've been waiting to deliver his last words, keeping them safe, just like he asked. Sarah reached for the envelope with her good hand, but Eleanor held it back for a moment. Before you open this, you need to understand. What Martin discovered, what got him killed, it goes deeper than money laundering. The construction contracts, the shell companies, they were just the surface. James moved closer to Sarah instinctively. Unprotective. Captain Martinez leaned forward, her interest sharpened. Deeper how? Political connections, Eleanor said quietly. Judges, senators, people who could make investigations disappear. Martin found proof of bribes going back 30 years. That's why they couldn't let him talk. She finally handed the envelope to Sarah. And that's why they're so desperate to stop you now. You're not just threatening their operation, you're threatening their whole power structure. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. The storm was moving faster than predicted, much like the events unfolding in James's kitchen. Sarah broke the seal on the envelope with trembling fingers, drawing out pages of Martin Cooper's precise handwriting. My dearest Sarah, she read aloud, her voice catching, if you're reading this, it means you've finally found your way back. Home. I pray you'll forgive an old man for not being there to help explain everything, but I trust Eleanor has kept these safe until you were ready. The radio suddenly burst to life with an urgent tone. Severe winter storm warning for Campbell County. Conditions expected to deteriorate rapidly. All residents advised to seek immediate shelter. Captain Martinez's radio crackled. Movement at the tree line, southeast corner. Multiple figures. James moved to the window, rifle ready. Through the swirling snow, he could make out dark shapes moving with purpose toward the ranch. How many? At least 4, the officer reported. Maybe more in the trees. They're using the storm for cover. Eleanor's face had gone pale. They followed me, she whispered. All these years being careful, and I led them right to you. No, Sarah said firmly, still holding Martin's letter. They were already coming. You just got here first. She looked at James, then Captain Martinez. We need time to read through these documents, to understand what Martin knew. Time just became a luxury, James said grimly, watching another shadow detach itself from the tree line. Buck, stay with Sarah. The dog pressed closer to her leg, understanding the command. Captain, Martinez was already mobilizing her people, coordinating their defense through quick, efficient radio commands. We've got the advantage of position, she said, and they don't know how many officers we have on site. The storm cellar, James said suddenly, not to hide, to protect the evidence. Everything Eleanor brought, everything Sarah has, we secure it there first, then deal with them. Sarah stood, swaying slightly but determined. I'll take it down. I know how to hide things so they can't be found. She met James's concerned look. Trust me, I've had 20 years of practice. The wind howled, louder, bringing the first heavy flakes of the new storm. Through the windows, the approaching figures were becoming harder to see in the growing whiteout conditions. But they were coming, using the weather as their ally, just as they had used shadow and secrets for decades. James checked his rifle last time, remembering his father's words. McKinnon land knows its own. Today, it would have to prove those words true. The old newspaper clippings spilled across the storm cellar's wooden table, yellowed pages telling fragments of a story 20 years in the making. Sarah spread them out with her good hand, while Buck stood guard at the cellar steps. Each headline added another piece to the puzzle. Construction contracts awarded under suspicious circumstances, mysterious deaths ruled accidents, judges retiring suddenly after key decisions. Look at the dates, Sarah said, pointing to a particular article. Every major contract approval came right after a significant campaign contribution from one of Anton's shell companies. She shuffled through Martin's meticulously organized papers. And here, the judge who dismissed the initial investigation into Dad's company. His son suddenly got a full scholarship to an expensive private school, courtesy of a charitable foundation that traced back to Anton. James studied the complex web of connections Martin Cooper had documented. He was building a case, piece by piece. No wonder they wanted him silenced. Above them, they could hear Captain Martinez's team moving into defensive positions. The storm's intensity had increased, wind howling through the barn's old boards like a living thing. But down here, surrounded by generations of McKinnon's storage and emergency supplies, they had a moment to piece together the full scope of what they were facing. Senator Harrison, Sarah read from Martin's notes, her voice tight with disbelief. He was the key, used his position on the Oversight Committee to bury investigations, redirect federal resources. In exchange, she pulled out a bank statement. $5 million, routed through 7 different countries. He's still in office, James said grimly. Term doesn't end for another 2 years. Not if these documents see the light of day. Sarah's hand trembled as she held up another page. Martin had proof of everything, recordings, transaction records, photographs of meetings that never officially happened. He created 3 complete sets of evidence, hid them separately. She smiled sadly. Just like Dad did. They were always more alike than they knew. Buck's ears suddenly pricked forward, and a moment later they heard it too. The muffled sound of gunfire above, barely audible through the storm. Sarah quickly gathered the documents, sliding them into a hidden compartment James's grandfather had built into the cellar wall decades ago. Your grandfather was paranoid about government overreach, James explained, helping her secure the hiding spot. Built secret spaces all over the ranch. Never thought they'd be used to protect evidence of actual government corruption. James. Sarah's voice was urgent as she pulled one last document from her pocket. There's something else you need to see, something I found in Dad's papers about your father. The paper was old, its creases well worn, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. William McKinnon, James's father, dated just 3 days before his fatal heart attack 15 years ago. My dearest friend Thomas, the letter began, what I've discovered about Harrison's involvement changes everything. They're watching me now, just like they watched you. If anything happens to me, tell James the heart attack wasn't natural. Tell him to protect the land. There's more buried here than just our family's histories. James felt the world tilt beneath his feet. All these years, he'd accepted the official explanation of his father's death. But now, Dad knew. He whispered, he was helping your father gather evidence. The realization hit him like a physical blow. That's why he insisted I never sell the ranch, no matter what offers came in. He wasn't just protecting our heritage. He was protecting proof of their crimes. Sarah reached for his hand, her touch anchoring him as the implications crashed over him in waves. Our fathers were working together, James. Even after we disappeared, they never stopped fighting. Another burst of gunfire above, closer this time. Buck growled low in his throat, positioning himself between the stairs and Sarah. Through the storm's fury, they could hear Captain Martinez shouting orders. "They're not just here for the evidence," James said, the pieces finally falling into place. "They're here for the ranch itself. Whatever proof our fathers hid, it's been right under our feet all along," Sarah finished. She looked around the cellar with new eyes. "Every secret space, every hidden compartment your grandfather built. Dad repurposed them," James nodded, memory and realization merging. "All those times I caught him down here late at night, saying he was just organizing old records." The cellar door burst open, bringing a swirl of snow and Captain Martinez's urgent voice. "They've breached the perimeter. We need to move, now." James helped Sarah to her feet, mind racing through everything he knew about the ranch's hidden spaces, every story his father had ever told him about the land. Somewhere in those memories lay the key to finding what their fathers had died protecting. "Together," Sarah said firmly, reading his thoughts. "Whatever we find, whatever happens next, we finish this together." Buck pressed close to their legs, a solid presence in the chaos. Above them, the storm raged on, and somewhere in its fury, Anton Kovac and his men were coming to claim secrets buried in McKinnon land. But this time, they wouldn't find just one person standing in their way. This time, they'd face the combined strength of two families, united by love, loss, and an unwavering dedication to the truth. James's father's rifle felt right in his hands as he crouched by the barn window, its wooden stock smooth with decades of use. William McKinnon had always said this Winchester was more than just a tool. It was a piece of family history, a symbol of their commitment to protecting what mattered. Now, as shadows moved through the swirling snow, that commitment was being put to its greatest test. 3 men approaching from the east, Captain Martinez whispered into her radio. Another 2 circling around back, well-armed, moving like professionals. She glanced at James. "Your property. Any advantages we should know about?" "Dad always said the land itself was our best ally," James replied, adjusting his position. "Those drifts they're walking through. There's a series of drainage ditches. Underneath, one wrong step and they'll be waist-deep in snow." As if on cue, a muffled curse cut through the storm's howl, followed by the distinctive sound of someone struggling in deep snow. Buck's ears twitched, but the dog remained steadfastly by Sarah's side, guarding her as she worked quickly at the barn's back wall. "The panel should be here somewhere," she muttered, running her good hand along the weathered wood. Martin's letter mentioned a hidden cache behind the 3rd support beam. A soft click, and a small section of wall swung inward. "Found it." Inside the hidden compartment lay a metal lockbox, its surface dusty but intact. Sarah pulled it out, carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "Martin's insurance policy. He said if anything happened to him, this would explain everything." A bullet splintered the window frame above them, sending everyone ducking for cover. Captain Martinez's team returned fire, the exchange brief but intense. Through the gunfire, a voice carried on the wind, cultured, accented, and chillingly familiar to Sarah. 20 years is a long time to chase shadows, my dear," Anton Kovac called out. "Why don't we end this game now? You can't protect evidence that was never meant to exist." James saw Sarah's face harden at the sound of that voice. This was the man who had destroyed her family, who had ordered Martin Cooper's death, who had possibly been behind his own father's murder. Buck growled low in his throat, picking up on the tension. "Your father made his choice," Kovac continued. "As did Martin Cooper, as did William McKinnon. Don't force us to add more names to that list." "He's trying to bait us," Captain Martinez whispered. "Keep us talking while his men get into position." But James was watching Sarah, seeing something shift in her expression. "The names," she said softly. "James, that's it, the names." She turned to him, eyes bright with sudden understanding. "Your father's cattle brands? Remember how he changed them that last year? Said he was modernizing the system?" James's mind raced back. His father had indeed modified their traditional brand, adding small marks that seemed unnecessary at the time. He was encoding information, he realized, right out in the open, where anyone could see it but no one would understand. "Every cattle brand has to be registered." Sarah nodded quickly. "Official records, impossible to alter without raising suspicions. Your father and mine, they didn't just hide evidence here on the ranch. They created a paper trail that would stand. Up in court, disguised as routine business records. Another burst of gunfire interrupted them, closer this time. Captain Martinez signaled her team to shift positions. "Whatever you're going to do it fast. They're getting bold." James handed his father's rifle to one of the officers and moved to the barn's back corner, where decades of ranch records were stored in heavy leather binders. "Help me find the brand registrations from 2010, he told Sarah. That was the year Dad changed everything. Buck suddenly barked a warning, and the barn door splintered under a heavy impact. Time was running out. Sarah found the binder they needed just as flashlight beams began cutting through the snow-filled air outside. "One chance," James said, taking Sarah's hand. "There's a tunnel, runs from the back of the barn to the old line shack. Dad used it during blizzards to check on stranded cattle." Captain Martinez nodded grimly. "Go. We'll keep them busy here." She pressed a satellite phone into Sarah's hand. "Call for backup once you're clear. The storm's grounding our helicopters, but we've got teams standing by in Sheridan." James led Sarah to the hidden tunnel entrance, Buck following silently. Behind them, the sound of gunfire intensified. As they slipped into the darkness, Sarah clutched both the lockbox and the brand registry close. "Your father was brilliant," she whispered, "hiding the truth in plain sight all these years." "McKinnon's stubbornness," James replied, managing a tight smile. "Dad used to say the best place to hide something was where everyone could see it, but nobody thought to look." He squeezed her hand. "Let's make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain." Sarah's journal lay open on the line shack's rough wooden table, its pages illuminated by their single battery-powered lantern. She'd kept it through all the years of running, documenting everything in a code of her own devising. Now, as the storm raged outside and Buck kept watch by the window, she translated passages that suddenly carried new weight. "March 15th, 2010, she read aloud. "Dad's acting strange again. Says William McKinnon reached out through their old hunting buddy network. Something about cattle brands and registration numbers. He spent all night working on papers he wouldn't. Let me see." She looked up at James. "I had no idea they were in contact." James spread the brand registry documents beside her journal, comparing dates and numbers. "Look at this sequence." He pointed to a series of registrations. "Dad modified our brand 6 times that year. Each change subtle, an extra dot here, a slightly longer stroke there. But when you line them up chronologically, they form a pattern," Sarah finished, seeing it too. "And here in my journal, the dates of Dad's late-night work sessions match perfectly with each brand change." She flipped through more pages, her good hand trembling slightly. "I wrote everything down, trying to make sense of it all, never realizing I was documenting their code as it developed." Buck's sudden alertness drew their attention. The dog's ears pricked forward, his body tensing. A moment later, they heard it too, the crunch of snow under careful footsteps. "They found the tunnel," James whispered, moving to check their defenses. The line shack was small but solid, built to withstand Wyoming's worst weather. Right now, it needed to withstand worse than weather. Sarah gathered the documents quickly, but not before one last entry caught her eye. "James, listen to this. December 1, 2010. Dad finally told me why we can never go home. Said some things are worth dying for, but the truth isn't just about dying. It's about making sure the right people live to tell it." The footsteps were closer now. Buck moved silently to position himself between Sarah and the door, his training and protective instincts merging perfectly. James checked his backup revolver, his father's other legacy, kept hidden in the line shack for emergencies. "Your father was right," James said quietly, "but they forgot something important when they killed our fathers." He met Sarah's eyes in the lantern light. "They left us alive to tell the truth," a voice carried through the storm. Anton Kovac again, closer than comfort. The line shack, yes, a predictable choice, but then the McKinnons were always predictable. In their determination, the last word dripped with contempt. William proved that in the end. Such a convenient heart attack. James felt Sarah's hand slip into his, squeezing gently. Her voice, when she spoke, carried none of the fear he knew she must be feeling. "You know what else is predictable, Anton? How men like you always underestimate what you can't control." She pulled something from her jacket pocket, a small recorder, its red light blinking steadily. "I learned from my father's mistakes. Every conversation, every threat since you found me in Denver. It's all recorded, uploaded automatically to secure servers. Dead man's switch. If anything happens to me, it all goes public." The footsteps outside stopped. In the sudden silence, the storm's howl seemed louder, more immediate. Buck's low growl rumbled in harmony with the wind. "You're bluffing," Anton called, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "You couldn't have—" 20 years, Sarah cut him off. 20 years of running, hiding, watching over my shoulder. Did you think I wasn't learning, preparing? Every daughter you forced into exile, every widow you created, we all learned from our father's sacrifices." James moved to the window, staying low. He could make out shapes in the swirling snow, at least 4 men, maybe more hanging back, all armed, all professional, but Sarah's words had caused them to hesitate. "Martin Cooper's evidence, my father's documents, William McKinnon's coded records, they're all just backup now," Sarah continued, her voice stronger. "Insurance against exactly this moment. So what's it going to be, Anton? Risk everything you've built on the chance I'm bluffing?" The silence stretched, broken only by the storm's fury. Then Anton's voice again, tight with controlled rage. "This isn't over." "No," Sarah agreed softly, "but it's not ending the way you planned." They listened as the footsteps retreated, taking with them 20 years of shadows. But neither James nor Sarah relaxed. Buck remained alert, sensing the moment wasn't truly over. "They'll be back," James said, checking the satellite phone signal. "With more men, different tactics," Sarah nodded, her hand still in his. "But not tonight, and tonight might be all we need." She looked down at her journal, at the brand registry, at all the pieces of truth their fathers had died protecting. "We have the evidence, the recordings, and most importantly, we have each other." Outside, the storm began to ease, as if nature itself had decided enough was enough. But in the line shack's lantern light, surrounded by proof of 2 decades of courage and sacrifice, James and Sarah knew the real storm, the one that would finally clear away 20 years of shadows, was just beginning. The broken fence post lay in the snow like a fallen soldier, marking the spot where Anton's men had first breached the property line. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, James and Sarah stood on the porch of the main house, surveying the aftermath of the night's confrontation. Captain Martinez's team had secured the perimeter, but the tension in the air remained thick as morning frost. Buck patrolled the yard, his movements precise and purposeful, while Sarah held the satellite phone that would set everything in motion. "Senator Harrison's office opens in 1 hour, she said, checking her watch. "Every major news outlet in 3 states has received encrypted files that will unlock the moment we make this call. 20 years of evidence, all leading to this moment." James studied her profile in the early light. The scared 18-year-old girl who had disappeared 2 decades ago was gone, replaced by a woman tempered by years of careful planning and patient resilience. Yet when she looked at him, He still saw echoes of the Sarah he'd fallen in love with under summer stars. "We could wait," he offered quietly. "Give you more time to recover. Make sure everything's in order." Sarah shook her head, her splintered arm cradled against her chest. "Dad always said there's never a perfect moment for the truth. You just have to recognize when hiding it becomes worse than revealing it." She squared her shoulders. "We've got Martin's evidence, the coded brand registries, my recordings of Anton, and most importantly, we're both alive to testify." A sudden commotion at the gate drew their attention. Buck's bark carried across the snow-covered yard as a convoy of black SUVs approached. But these weren't Anton's men returning. The lead vehicle bore federal government plates. "Right on time," Captain Martinez said, joining them on the porch. "That'll be the FBI's public corruption unit. Called them in as soon as we confirmed. The senator's involvement." She gave Sarah a respectful nod. "You did good work, staying alive long enough to bring this home." The first rays of sun caught the promise ring on Sarah's finger, making it sparkle like fresh snow. James remembered his father's words about the land, knowing its own, about some promises being worth any price. The broken fence post might mark where their defenses had been breached, but it also marked where they had finally stopped running. "Ms. Mitchell?" One of the FBI agents approached, her badge catching the morning light. "We need to take your official statement, and there's someone here who'd like to speak with you." She gestured to the second SUV, where an elderly man was emerging with the help of a cane. Sarah's grip on James's hand tightened. "Judge Reynolds," she breathed. "Dad's old friend from law school. The one who had to recuse himself when they threatened his grandchildren." The judge finished, making his way carefully through the snow. "Thomas told me to watch for signs, to be ready when the time came. When I heard about the shooting at the ranch," he smiled sadly, "well, let's just say I've been waiting 20 years to testify about certain conversations with Senator Harrison." Buck padded over to inspect the newcomer, then returned to Sarah's side, apparently satisfied. The dog's presence had become a constant, as if he'd appointed himself guardian of not just Sarah, but of the truth they were about to expose. James watched as more vehicles arrived. State police, federal agents, even a few news vans held at the gate. The quiet of his ranch was giving way to the machinery of justice, 20 years delayed, but finally in motion. The broken fence post would be repaired, but some barriers, once broken, could never be rebuilt, and shouldn't be. Sarah straightened beside him, her face set with determination. "It's time," she said simply, and pressed the button on the satellite phone that would send her recordings to every news outlet waiting for the signal. Around the country, encrypted files were unlocking, evidence was being unveiled, and the carefully constructed house of cards that had cost them all so much was about to collapse. The morning sun climbed higher, melting the snow from the broken fence post. James thought about boundaries, the ones marked by wood and wire, and the deeper ones marked by courage and conviction. His father and Thomas Mitchell had died protecting the truth. Martin Cooper had died discovering it. But here, in the clear light of a Wyoming morning, their children would finally tell it together. He asked softly. Sarah's answer was to step forward, Buck at her side, ready to tell the story that had begun with a broken promise and would end with a promise renewed. Some fences, once broken, cleared the way for something stronger to be built in their place. The sunrise photograph sat propped against the windowsill in James's study, captured by a young reporter who'd arrived just as the story broke. It showed the McKinnon ranch house bathed in golden morning light, with Sarah standing on the porch, her splintered arm visible but her stance unbowed. James stood beside her and Buck sat alert at their feet. Behind them, the snow-covered mountains rose like silent witnesses to history being made. 3 days had passed since Sarah's evidence had been released to the world. Senator Harrison had resigned within hours of the first revelations. Anton Kovac was in federal custody, along with 3 state judges and a dozen other conspirators. The machinery of justice, so long frustrated, was finally grinding into motion. They found Martin's body, Sarah said quietly, looking up from the morning's newspaper. She sat in James's father's old leather chair, Buck dozing at her feet. Anonymous. Tip led them to a ravine in the national forest. After all these years, her voice caught slightly. James moved to her side, resting his hand on her shoulder. The newspaper headline told the story. 20-year conspiracy exposed. Political corruption, murder, and the courage of two families. Below it, photos of their fathers, William McKinnon and Thomas Mitchell, stood alongside Martin Cooper's, three men whose dedication to truth had cost them everything but secured their children's future. "Eleanor's flying in for the funeral," James said softly. "She wants you to speak at the service." Sarah nodded, touching the promise ring that still graced her finger. "Martin deserves to have his story told. All of it. Not just how he died, but how he lived. How he never stopped fighting for what was right, even when he knew it might cost him everything." Buck's ears perked up at the sound of approaching vehicles. Through the window they could see Captain Martinez's car leading a small convoy up. The drive. The captain had become a frequent visitor, coordinating the ongoing investigation that was revealing new layers of corruption almost daily. "The grand jury convenes next week," Sarah said, rising from the chair. Her arm was healing well, though the doctor said it would be another month before the splint could come off. "They want us both to testify. Together," James reminded her. The word carrying the weight of a vow. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of statements, depositions, and interviews, but they'd faced it all side by side, just as they'd face whatever came next. Captain Martinez knocked briefly before entering, her face bearing the satisfied look of someone delivering good news. "We found the rest of William McKinnon's encoded records," she announced. "Filed with the State Brand Inspector's Office, just like you thought. The man was brilliant, hiding crucial evidence in annual cattle registration forms." She laid out a series of documents on James's desk. Each modification to the brand contained part of a routing number. When arranged chronologically, they reveal every illegal transaction Harrison and Kovacs made through their shell companies. Your father documented everything, knowing someday someone would understand what to look for. Sarah studied the papers, her good hand tracing the subtle modifications to the McKinnon brand. "He and Dad worked together even after we disappeared," she said softly, "each doing their part to build a case that would stand up in court, no matter how long it took. The U.S. Attorney's Office is calling it one of the most sophisticated whistleblower operations they've ever seen," Martinez continued. 3 men, working independently but coordinated, gathering evidence that would eventually expose corruption at the highest levels of state government. Buck suddenly raised his head, tail wagging, as Eleanor Cooper's car appeared in the driveway. The dog had taken to all their visitors with remarkable discernment, as if he somehow knew they were allies in the cause of justice. "There's something else," Martinez said, her expression softening. "We found a safety deposit box in Sheridan, registered to William McKinnon. Inside was a letter for you, James, dated the day before he died. And this—" She handed him a small velvet box. James opened it carefully. Inside lay his mother's engagement ring, the one his father had always said would be his when the time was right. A note tucked into the lid read simply, "For when Sarah comes home." Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the ring. "He knew," she whispered. "Even then, he knew I'd find my way back." The morning sun streamed through the window, catching the ring's diamond and sending prisms dancing across the study walls. Outside, Eleanor was making her way to the porch, carrying a box of Martin's personal effects she thought Sarah should have. Buck trotted out to greet her, ever the faithful guardian. 20 years of shadows were finally giving way to light. The truth, so carefully preserved by 3 brave men, was now being revealed by those they'd left behind, and in its revelation came not just justice, but the fulfillment of hopes long deferred. James looked at Sarah, seeing in her eyes the same mix of memory and promise he felt in his heart. Some things their fathers had believed were worth dying for, but standing here, In the morning light, surrounded by proof of their courage and vindication, James knew that some things were even more worth living for. The new ranch sign caught the late afternoon sun, its fresh paint gleaming against the weathered fence post. McKinnon and Mitchell Ranch, Eston, 1923. James watched as Sarah traced the letters with her fingers, her splint finally removed after 6 weeks of healing. Buck sat beside them in the truck, his head hanging out the window in obvious contentment. "Dad would have loved this," Sarah said softly. "He always said the Mitchell name belonged in Wyoming." She smiled, remembering. Even during those first hard years of running, he'd talk about the ranch, about the way the mountains looked at sunset. The spring thaw had come early to the valley, bringing with it new beginnings. The grand jury had handed down indictments against 32 people involved in the conspiracy. Senator Harrison had turned state's evidence, his testimony revealing corruption that reached into the governor's office itself. Anton Kovac faced multiple life sentences, but more important than the justice being served were the smaller moments of healing, like Martin Cooper finally being laid to rest beside his parents, with Eleanor standing proud as Sarah delivered a eulogy that left no doubt about his courage. Or the day they'd found the last of William McKinnon's coded records, hidden in plain sight among routine ranch paperwork. "The soil samples came back clean," James said, as they drove toward the main house. "No trace of the chemicals Harrison's company was illegally dumping. The land stayed true, just like Dad believed it would." Sarah nodded, her hand finding his. The promise ring on her finger had been joined by his mother's engagement ring, their own private ceremony, witnessed by the mountains and blessed by the memory of those who'd sacrificed so much to make it possible. Buck's excited bark announced their arrival at the house, where Captain Martinez's car was already parked. The captain had become more than just an ally in their fight for justice. She'd become a friend, someone who understood the weight of truth and the price of preserving it. "Got the final paperwork from the title company," Martinez called from the porch, waving a thick envelope. "The Mitchell properties are officially released from federal hold. Everything's back in Sarah's name, clear and clean." The news wasn't unexpected, but it still brought tears to Sarah's eyes. 20 years of living under assumed names, of watching her family's legacy languish under government seizure, finally over. She could be Sarah Mitchell again, could reclaim not just her name, but her place in the valley. Inside, the house had slowly transformed over the past weeks. Sarah's touch was everywhere, fresh curtains in the kitchen, her mother's old recipes propped against the cookbook stand, family photos finding their place alongside the McKinnon ancestors on the walls. Even Buck had adapted, claiming a bed by the fireplace while maintaining his protective watch over them both. "There's something else," Martinez said, pulling another document from her briefcase. "Judge Reynolds found this in his old case files. It's the original partnership agreement between William McKinnon and Thomas Mitchell, dated just weeks before everything happened. They were planning to merge the ranches even then." James and Sarah exchanged glances, the weight of 20 years, of separation and sacrifice, settling into perspective. Their fathers hadn't just been collecting evidence, they'd been trying to preserve a future they hoped their children would one day share. "They never lost faith," Sarah said quietly, studying the unsigned partnership papers. "Even when everything fell apart, they believed we'd find our way back here." Buck's sudden alertness drew their attention to the window. A familiar truck was pulling up. Eleanor Cooper, bringing the last of Martin's personal effects from her house. The dog trotted out to greet her, his tail wagging in welcome. "Martin would be proud," Eleanor said later, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing coffee and memories. "He always said the truth was like water. It might take the long way round, might go underground for a while, but it always found its way to the surface eventually." The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching the new sign they'd hung in the entryway. "The truth of the land endures." William McKinnon's words, carved into wood by James's grandfather, now serving as a testament to two families. unwavering faith in justice. Sarah moved to the window, looking out over the land that had called her home through 20 years of exile. The spring grass was beginning to green, promising new life after the long winter. Behind her, James and Eleanor discussed plans for the summer grazing rotation, their voices comfortable and familiar in the old kitchen. Buck pressed against her legs, offering his steady presence. From this window she could see the mountains that had witnessed everything, the joy of first love, the pain of separation, the triumph of truth finally revealed. The same mountains that would now watch over their future, standing guard over. Memories preserved and promises renewed. "We're home," she whispered to the dog, her hand resting on his head. Buck's tail wagged once, firmly, as if to say he'd known it all along. Some things, after all, were written in the land itself, just waiting for the right time to be revealed. The wedding band caught the light as James slipped it onto Sarah's finger, simple gold reflecting the sunset that painted the mountains in shades of purple and rose. They stood beneath the old cottonwood tree, where they'd first made their promises. 20 years ago, but this time the whole valley had come to witness. Buck sat alertly at their feet, wearing a special collar for the occasion, his coat brushed to a shine. In the gathered crowd, Eleanor Cooper dabbed at her eyes, while Captain Martinez, now a close family friend, smiled from her place among the guests. Even Judge Reynolds had made the trip, his stern face softened by the significance of the moment. "The land knows its own," James said softly, repeating the words his father had lived by. "It remembers the promises we make, the truths we protect, the love we honor." His voice carried across the hushed gathering, steady and sure. 20 years ago, we made a promise under this tree. Life took us down separate paths, but the promise remained, carved into our hearts like brands on leather. Sarah's eyes shone with tears as she looked up at him. Her free hand held his mother's ring, ready to complete their exchange. "Through all the years of running, all the different names and places, I carried one truth with me," she said. "That, somewhere in Wyoming, under these mountains and these stars, was the only man I'd ever truly love, the only home my heart would ever know." Buck's tail wagged as she slipped the ring onto James's finger. In the front row, old ranch hands who'd known them both as children wiped discreet tears from weathered cheeks. The story of the Mitchell-McKinnon legacy had become valley legend, a tale of love and justice spanning 2 decades, ending not in tragedy but in triumph. The reception was held in the newly restored barn, its walls hung with quilts sewn by generations of McKinnon and Mitchell women. A special place of honor held the quilt Martha McKinnon had left unfinished, now completed by Sarah with help from Eleanor, incorporating patterns that told their families' intertwined story. To William and Thomas, Judge Reynolds raised his glass in toast. 2 men who never lost faith in justice, in family, or in the power of truth to prevail. He turned to Sarah and James. They'd be proud to see their children not just surviving, but thriving, carrying their legacy forward with the same courage they showed. As the evening deepened into night, lanterns cast warm light across the gathering. Buck moved among the day guests, accepting treats and attention with dignified grace, though he never strayed far from Sarah and James. His vigilant nature, so crucial during those dangerous days, had softened into protective contentment. "Look," Sarah pointed toward the mountains, where the first stars were appearing. "Remember how we used to count them, making wishes on each one?" James drew her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Only wish I ever made came true," he said softly. "Took 20 years, but here you are." The music shifted to an old country waltz, their song from that long-ago county fair where young love had first bloomed. As they moved onto the dance floor, the guests drew back, watching 2 decades of separation dissolve in the rhythm of hearts finally beating in time. Eleanor found herself standing next to Captain Martinez, both women watching the dancers. "Martin would have loved this," Eleanor said quietly. "He always said the truth was worth any price, but seeing them together like this makes it all worthwhile." The captain nodded, understanding. In her pocket was the final report on the conspiracy. case, 32 convictions, millions in recovered funds, and a complete overhaul of the state's judicial oversight system. But the real victory was here on the dance floor, in the simple sight of two people whose love had survived every attempt to destroy it. As the night drew to a close, Sarah and James stood on their porch, watching the last guests depart. Buck lay at their feet, ever faithful, ever vigilant. The mountains stood dark against the star-filled sky, ancient guardians of all the stories this valley had seen. "Welcome home, Mrs. McKinnon," James whispered, his lips brushing her ear. Sarah smiled, touching the wedding band that now paired with her engagement ring. "I think you mean Mrs. Mitchell McKinnon," she corrected teasingly. "The new sign says it all." Their laughter carried across the quiet ranch, a sound of joy too long delayed but finally perfectly realized. The truth had indeed found its way to the surface. Justice had been served, and love had proven stronger than any conspiracy. Buck raised his head, looking out into the darkness with peaceful alertness. The dog who had found Sarah in the snow, who had helped guard their secrets and protect their revelations, now watched over their happiness with the same steady devotion. The stars wheeled overhead, unchanged by the 20 years that had passed since their first promises under the cottonwood tree. But the people standing beneath them had been transformed by time and trial into something stronger. Like gold, refined by fire, like truth preserved through darkness, like love tested by time and found unbreakable. In the end, it was just as their fathers had believed. The land knew its own, the truth would prevail, and some promises, no matter how long deferred, were destined to be kept.